And a lot of people say about Sitchin that, oh, well, his translations were all wrong. Well, I, not so long ago, got an online translation of the NIBIRU that had nothing to do with Sitchin, and I read through it, and I thought, well, let's just see what, if you have a look through an academic reading of it, nothing to do with him, how it comes out, and I still came away with the same messages, because Sitchin was interpreting, he was taking that work, and he was saying, look, if you look at it from the point of view of seeing these names, these gods, in terms of planets, in terms of the solar system, then you can start to see this whole thing working, and you can start to see how there's a description of this rogue planet Marduk that enters the frame and changes everything and causes upheaval, and then disappears off into the void again. And I think that's a very strong argument. So why I'm saying this is because the description of this Marduk is really central. He describes it as a sort of very red, fiery object that's bright, commanding, lordly. And again, this really didn't gel with me with a planet that's just come out of the gloom.
Exactly.
We see these little comets that come out and they produce these great tails, but he wasn't really describing this. He was talking about a big red disk with lightning and halos and all kinds of stuff around it, and it brought with it these moons which were, potentially catastrophic, that this thing was flinging these moons around and causing destruction, and it sounded like a pretty major item. So I thought to myself, well, it sounds a little bit like a brown dwarf. Sounds a little bit like the thing that, I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, they talked about the possibility of an object called Nemesis.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some astronomers who were postulating back then that Nemesis was an object at the very edge of the solar system, and I mean really far out, with an orbit of like 26 million years or something like that. And it would periodically somehow fling down comets into the solar system that would cause extinction cycles. And, the dinosaurs got wiped out by such an event. So at some point during its orbit, all these things would fling down, and there would be this catastrophe. And I thought, well, if you took an object like that and you fitted that into this NIBIRU idea of Sitchin's and twined the two, then you can actually explain the Anunnaki. And the reason you can explain the Anunnaki is because brown dwarfs are rather special little objects. I'm actually going to talk about a small brown dwarf, not ones that are actually a star, but a very small one.
Okay.
So a brown dwarf is, if you took Jupiter and you continue to fling more matter into it, more hydrogen and helium, and made it more and more dense, Jupiter would actually shrink. As it got more massive, it would actually shrink a little bit, and it would turn dark. And after a while, it would ignite. Do you remember seeing one of Arthur C. Clarke's films where, I can't remember which one it was now, it was one of the sequels to 2001, and the idea was that those monoliths were constructed around Jupiter, and eventually they surrounded it completely, and it ignited into a second sun.
Right.
You remember that?
Yes.
This is a little bit like that. I think Arthur C. Clarke got onto something there. If you did that, consider this as the monolith that's throwing mass at it, and Jupiter contracts a little bit, it eventually sparks up into life, and it becomes a brown dwarf, which is what they were talking about in that film. And what I'm advocating is that as a binary star sort of thing, out in the outer solar system, one of these objects is actually out there. And this might sound absolutely incredible to most people, but strangely enough, it's less incredible to astronomers. They're actually more... they think it's more likely than most general members of the public for reasons which I'll outline.
Yeah, they believe it's there.
Well, they don't believe it's there, but they don't rule it out. And like I said, in the last 10 years, things have moved on. If you ask somebody in the mid-90s in astronomy, is it still possible that we might have a sub-brown dwarf orbiting the sun at a reasonably good distance away amongst the comets? They just laugh their heads off, I think. but things have changed, and there have been a lot of discoveries, scientific discoveries about the outer solar system in the last 10 years that have actually made quite a lot of them write in their academic papers, there's a possibility there might be something out there causing this. So that whole situation is moving in my direction. I'm in a very happy situation of having put this forward about 10 years ago and sitting here and watching as science catches up, which is fun. So, should I explain how you could have life out there with it?
Mm-hmm. And I think that Arthur Clarke movie that one was 2010.
Yes, that was it. I didn't want to say 2012 because that's the number that's ticking around my head.
Oh, yeah, that's the one we all think about.
But I knew it was something like that. Yeah, 2010, absolutely. But it is quite a nice image, and I think that gives you an idea of this Jupiter just sparking into life and going around the sun and being a second sun. It's a very, very nice
So
image.
It's not exactly a twins from our sun, right?
Well, it wouldn't be a twin insofar as the category of star. It would be below the lowest category known, really.
So you wouldn't call it a binary star?
You could,
or
technically.
Would you? Okay.
There is this sort of crossover between planet and star, and it's a complicated business. And to be honest, it's not resolved. It's a little bit like Pluto. Yeah, Pluto was always known as one of the planets, and then I think it was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it took it away.
Yeah, and this is a little bit like this. Between planets and stars, you've got this whole spectrum of different possible objects, and this sub-brown dwarf is the bit between a gas giant and a brown dwarf. And a brown dwarf is more or less a sort of bona fide star. But because they haven't found many of these sub-brown dwarfs, in fact, I don't know if they found any yet. They know they exist, but they're very difficult to find. Those objects aren't really clearly defined as to whether they're stars or not. So really, when they're born, when they're very young and they're quite bright, which they are, they're very bright when they're young, they're clearly a star. And as they settle down and after a few million years and burn up some of their fuel and become effectively sort of a floating ember in space, they turn dark, and then you sort of look at them and think, well, that's not really a star anymore, that's a planet.
Exactly. You know what I mean? Exactly. Because of the shape and because it's not emitting light anymore. Not
particularly, but it's rather like having a fire in a grill that's gone out, and it's still a bit hot, and you can still see a little bit of spark.
Without the embers.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's how I think this thing would look. And that's why it fits in with the Enuma Elish.
Does it have any glow at all to it?
I think so.
Okay.
The thing is, it's difficult to establish exactly what it would look like because we haven't looked at any. And it's still a theoretical item. So until astronomers actually spot these things, old sub-brown dwarfs, and can start to say, they've got these properties X, Y, and Z, it's difficult to say that absolutely fits in with Sitchin. One thing I do know, and which fits in with Sitchin, is that its colour would be somewhere between red and sort of purple and magenta, and it would be sort of cloudy and dark and smoky. I'm pretty sure of that. And, that fits the bill with the Enuma Elish. And the other thing about brown dwarfs is they tend to surprise us. They can emit a lot of radiation. They can, have bursts of peak where they're releasing.
Would it have had a heat source for Nibiru?
Well, this is it. This is exactly the thing. So this moves me on to the next point, which is you might not necessarily want to sit on top of a brown dwarf. The upper atmosphere would be a pretty ghastly place to be, I would think. But it's got moons, and the moons are going to be warmed by it, and they're going to be warmed by it in several ways. One of them is they're going to be pretty close to it because it's small, so they're going to be warmed by the heat coming from it. Secondly, like you played Santana earlier on.
Yes.
Europa.
Europa it is.
Yes. Now, Europa is this fascinating moon that orbits Jupiter that is internally warmed by its proximity to the gas giant Jupiter. So just by being next to it, it's got this tidal forces that kind of wrench the inside of the planet as it moves around and creates the internal heat. And that allows oceans to exist on Europa underneath a crust of solid ice.
And I think they may be surprised. It may not be as deep as they think, the ice.
That's possible, but we know that Io, which is the moon closer to Jupiter, is just an inferno.
Yes.
It's all this volcanical activity because it's just absolutely caught in this gravitational wave of Jupiter. And Callisto and Ganymede, a bit further out, are also candidates for having these oceans.
Right.